Okay, folks, so today I'm just talking about my initial thoughts on the Gulag Archipelago. Now, I'm not reading all three of those books, the entirety of it. I'm reading the abridged version but here's the thing. Solzhenitsyn did the abridged version. This abridged version was done by him because in his later years, he decided, I'll take it and make something that's more digestible for like people who want an introduction to what the Gulag Archipelago is, and want more of a condensed version. But it was done by him, and that I give a lot of credence to because he knows probably what the most important parts are to keep in that as an introduction to the Gulag Archipelago. And so, in and of itself, this book is like, I think it's about 600 some odd pages, but it kind of condenses what he considers probably the most important parts of the three books. And since since it is truly authoritative, because it's the author himself who did the abridgment, I put a lot of credibility into it. So I'm just pointing out things that I'm noticing. I'm not necessarily trying to teach a lesson. I'm just saying what I'm taking away from it. This isn't going to be some super duper organized thing or presentation on YouTube or something like that. It's just me commenting on what I take note of, especially how when you when you actually when you execute communism, or you how do you say it, when you put it into action, okay, when you put communism into action, it's devastating. That's what I'm realizing is, no matter how you look at it, no matter how many excuses you can give it, how much you try to soften it, you hear a lot of people who call themselves socialists nowadays or communists in like America, and they say, well, that was done wrong. You say, oh, well, one third of Cambodian population was killed because of communism. And they say, yeah, but that was done wrong. Okay, well, 30 million people plus, that's just what we know. In 30 to 60 million people in the Soviet Union were murdered because of communism in these gulags. Well, they didn't do it right. Well, in China, over 100 million people were killed in prison camps because of communism. Well, they didn't do it right. How many times are we going to go through this scenario of genocide on a monstrous scale that the world has never seen before, especially throughout the 20th century? How many times are we going to do this? This is the worst excuse I've ever heard for murder. Well, we just didn't do it right. Okay? So I don't buy that at all, in the sense of like human nature, in the sense of, if you call yourself a socialist and you call yourself a humanitarian at the same time, I believe that's probably the greatest contradiction I've ever heard. So I don't believe you. And this is a book that will open your eyes to this. I knew pieces and parts of the Gulag Archipelago, but I'm starting to read it and just highlight stuff that I've had questions about, that I want to, if you ever have to talk to somebody who's all intent on socialism or a centralized government, centralized planning, these are the effects of centralized planning. And the similarities exist in China, they exist in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge, they exist in Venezuela, all the failed states of communism, they all exist like this. And they themselves can't keep it up. And even economically, they can't. So they have to dip into what? Capitalism. And so anyway, here's just like an example. Socialists, or people who claim to be socialists, they really like to, I don't know how to say it, shellac this. They like to, how do you say it? they like to gloss this over, a veneer. They like to put a veneer over everything and soften socialism. Socialism is like this tempting piece of candy for young people who are already feeling kind of rage or realizing what they have to face in life and go, oh, and the socialism comes out and goes, hey, try me. Everybody gets paid universal income. Everybody's equal. It will be wonderful. No, everybody will get paid a universal income of $0 to $1, and everybody will be equally miserable. That's the part that they leave out. And don't make no mistake, corporatists have no interest in capitalism. What they practice is not capitalism. Most of the biggest corporations in the world are supported by government money, by taxpayer money. Yeah, that's how they became corporations. They got subsidies from the federal government. They got breaks. They got funding from the federal government. This isn't capitalism. So make no mistake, and they'll try to convince you. Marx, he tried to abuse that principle and say, well, see the big evil capitalists. Look what they do to you, these big factories and companies. This isn't capitalism. This is monopolism and oligarchy. This isn't the practice of free trade, selling and buying goods from each other. This isn't that. This has nothing to do with that. This has to do with dominating and destroying all competition. And that's what a one world state wants. That's what a totalitarian state wants. So make no mistake, Marx abused that term. He took that and made sure to abuse it, because his teachings were based, he's a mystic. That guy it's all mystical, what he said. And the truth of real Marxism comes out with the deaths of 30 to 60 million people in the Soviet Union. So with that, let me just start here. These are things that I just highlighted just randomly. He says here, right here, if you can see it. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Let me show you, gotta show you the actual reading. It says here, one has to give the organs their due. Now, the organs, I think, is what he calls the bureaucracy of the state. He just calls it the organs because they help the body function. The body of the Soviet state is these organs that help move it. You know, like think of pancreas, lungs. They help keep the body alive. They help do certain functions. One is to help the body breathe and to get oxygen. One is to help digest food and turn it into nutrition. One is to swallow stuff. One is to process toxins like the liver, stuff like that. So I think that's what he means is the organs they're due. This is the bureaucracy of the Soviet state. So that's my assumption. I'm not going to look anything up. I'm going off of context only. So you can put in the comments if you think I'm off or whatever. That's fine. One has to give the organs their due, the Soviet state, the bureaucracy their due. And I'll just call it the bureaucracy because that's what I think I'm pretty much getting the inference from here. In an age when public speeches, the plays in our theaters, and women's fashions all seem to have come off assembly lines, arrests can be of the most varied kind. They take you aside in a factory corridor after you have had your pass checked and you're arrested. They take you from a military hospital with a temperature of 102, as they did with Hans Bernstein, and the doctor will not raise a peep about your arrest. Just let him try. They'll take you right off the operating table, as they took N.M. Vorobyev, a school inspector in 1936 in the middle of an operation for stomach ulcer, and drag you off to a cell as they did him, half alive and all bloody, as Karpunich recollects. That's what I like here, is he's actually referring, he doesn't just say this anecdotally, he says it in a respect of an actual, well, anecdotally, but referring to actual experiences. And that's why he's naming these people, so that you go, oh, wait, this isn't just talking vaguely. This is talking like, this is from direct experience. A school inspector, Vorobyev, a school inspector in 1936 in the middle of an operation for stomach ulcer, It makes it much more visceral and real because it is real. And this is how real it is. Let's see. There's another line here where people say this, and I hear this stuff too nowadays. When governments crack down, they become more censorious, they become more totalitarian, dictator-like, as with the Biden presidential regime. That's who they are. They're ushering in. They're trying to get kudos for being the ones who ushered in the new Lenin revolution, the October Revolution. That's essentially what the Biden White House presidency is right now, is they want to usher this in, okay? It's going to be a little different here in America, but here's one thing I see what people say all the time. Is people say, oh, resistance, like right here. Why didn't you resist? Today, those who have continued to live on in comfort scold those who suffered. So this comes from people who've already suffered. Or why didn't you resist? And they're like, well, I'm in prison now. Yes, resistance should have begun right there at the moment of the arrest itself, but it did not begin. And so they are leading you. During a daylight arrest, there's always that brief and unique moment when they're leading you, either inconspicuously on the basis of a cowardly deal you have made, or else quite openly, their pistols unholstered through a crowd of hundreds of just such doomed innocents as yourself. You aren't gagged. You really can and you really ought to cry out that you are being arrested, that villains in disguise are trapping people, that arrests are being made on the strength of false denunciations, that millions are being subjected to silent reprisals. If many such outcries had been heard all over the city in the course of a day, would not our fellow citizens perhaps have begun to bristle, and would arrests perhaps no longer have been so easy? In 1927, when submissiveness had not yet softened our brains to such a degree, 2 Chekists tried to arrest a woman on Serpukhov Square during the day. She grabbed hold of the stanchion of a street lamp and began to scream, refusing to submit. A crowd gathered. There had to have been that kind of woman. There had to have been that kind of crowd, too. Passers-by didn't all just close their eyes and hurry by. The quick young men immediately became flustered. They can't work in the public eye. They got into their car and fled. Right then and there, she should have gone to the railroad station and left. But she went home to spend the night, and during the night they took her off to the Lubyanka. The Lubyanka is the secret police station in Moscow, I think. So you might have to check on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. So it's an actual building that is still there to this day. So I just think that's interesting because he's saying maybe people should have said stuff. They were so, people wanted to be good citizens. There was a lot of Soviet citizens that were just regular people. They paid their taxes, they did their things, but because they were good law-abiding citizens, the police kind of expected that they would just come quietly or be obedient and just come with them when they arrested them. But he was saying there were people who actually made a stink in a big crowd when they were being arrested, and the soldiers ran away. The secret police ran away, but they came eventually for him. But they ran away so that people would know, hey, there's a problem here. And so it shows you the deep state also, this one thing that is the curious, biggest fear of the deep state is people. The people themselves. The people scare the crap out of them. This is why they do this. And they always start doing this first. They'll do this because they go, well, what if the people rise up? What if the people... So what we'll do is we will preemptively move in and take the offensive against these people, the offensive against something that's in their mind, that they think, oh, people are going to rise up. People get mad at this. So we will preemptively attack them. We will preemptively start the war against people, these people that we fear, and start arresting them in droves so that they don't rise up against us, that there won't be that. So we can preemptively get them. We can kind of pull the rug out from under them before they realize it. And it worked really well in the Soviet Union. It works in general, works well where there's a lot of generally law-abiding citizens. And you could ask the question, what's the point in being a law-abiding citizen? Well, everybody's going to get their turn. In a totalitarian state, do you think these animals that are illegal immigrants, dead serious, yeah, I said it, a lot of these animals that are illegal immigrants, now not all of them are, some are genuine good human beings, but many of them are animals and criminals. Do you think many of these animals and criminals, do you think their reign of terror, being not punished for their crimes, not sent back over the border, being given $5,000 stipends, being given cell phones, do you think that's going to last? Of course it's not. Because when the totalitarian state gets everything they want, they will turn right on those people. In fact, those are the first people usually to get killed or executed, are the people that were the useful idiots that helped the elites get full control of people and to obtain a deep state, a dark state. Once they have obtained that totalitarian rule, they're going to turn right around on those people and probably kill them too. They have no use for them. Those animals were only useful in keeping the law-abiding citizens subjugated. The biggest, most fearful entity for the secret state, the deep state, the intelligence agencies, for a large centralized federal government is a law-abiding citizen. That's the person they loathe the most. Because they're not that person. They're not law-abiding. They don't abide the law. They're criminals. And criminals hate that. They don't like that. That's like oil and water. So you got to get rid of them. So anyway, there's a chapter here called The History of Our Sewage Disposal System. And this is the sewage disposal system, and he's talking in a metaphorical sense of the human disposal system, of getting rid of all of these millions of people and sending them to gulags, prison camps, and eventually getting rid of them out of society, getting them out to the gulags and eventually killing them off, and millions of them. And that is how they purge the system to have their supposed utopia, their Garden of Eden that they want to go back to. And mind you, the Garden of Eden doesn't have enough room for everybody. That's their mindset. So they want to get back to that utopia, I guess. And I've heard that metaphor used, the utopia that a lot of these evil leaders, these dictators, these control freaks and authoritarians really want. They want the world to be the Garden of Eden before the fall of man type thing. And this is why it is a religious. Theirs is also religious minded. It's just called secularism, but it's actually a religion. Is that they want to get back to that. But they're like, but all these other people are rabble. They're all the fallen people. They're all fallen. They're representative of what happened after Eve took the fruit. And then they were fallen people. And then we had problems. And then the world became problematic. And damn it, why did people do that? They were so stupid. Why did they sin? Why did they have to do that? That's why I think there's a ton of parallels between communism and actual religion. And that's why I call Marx a cultist and a mystic, because his is just it's just a religion. No matter what he said about opium of the masses and all that junk, he was a mystic. So it said, before it came the wave of 1929, now these are the purges in Russia where they sent droves of people to the gulags. There were 3 or 4 of them, but the first big one, big wave, was in 1929 and 1930, of where they were just arresting millions of people. So the size of a good river Ob, which drove a mere 15 million peasants, maybe even more, out into the taiga and the tundra, where the gulags were. But peasants are a silent people, without a literary voice, nor do they write complaints or memoirs. No interrogators sweated out the night with them, nor did they bother to draw up formal indictments. It was enough to have a decree from the village Soviet. This wave poured forth, sank down into the permafrost, and even our most active minds recall hardly a thing about it. It is as if it had not yet even scarred the Russian conscience. And yet Stalin, and you and I as well, committed no more crime more heinous than this. And after it, there was the wave of 1944 and 1946. And there was a wave I think there was one in 1937 and 38 too. But I think that was interesting because you never hear the reason Soviets didn't take as much of a, I think there were people who were aware of what was going on and knew, but it's easier to just turn a blind eye in society, especially if you're not living that way. If you're not a peasant and you aren't living that hard life, being a farmer out in the podunks, outside of the cities where people aren't going to notice very much. They're just not going to notice. And the thing is these people weren't literate. A lot of them didn't know how to read or write. So you didn't hear about their stories. We don't have record of their stories. We really have very little records of their stories. And it's just kind of interesting how different classes of people, how history looks back on them. And I believe, for me, myself, and my religious beliefs are that after this life, we will hear these stories. These stories will be written down. We'll hear these stories from these people themselves. That's what I think, who are passed on. And it'll be amazing. And so I just think that's interesting characterization of them, that nobody really noticed or ignored it because it was just peasants. It was just super poor people, the forgotten class. Not considered so much contributors to society, although outside of the food, the actual sustenance for life. But I think people take that for granted with farmers a lot. And so with no literary voice. Okay. So he's talking here about the circles kept getting bigger as they raked in ordinary believers as well, old people and particularly women, who were the most stubborn believers of all, and who for many long years to come would be called nuns in the transit prisons. So they're talking about the Christians, people, God-fearing people, Orthodox Christians in Russia, when they started going after them. Okay, because there was a purge where they really were hell-bent on, let's arrest Christians. And so they arrested nuns, priests, all these types of people, and regular people who were just very devout. And so he says, true, they were supposedly being arrested and tried not for their actual faith, but for openly declaring their convictions and for bringing up their children in the same spirit. As Tanya Kodkovich wrote, you can pray freely, but just so God alone can hear. She received a 10-year sentence for these verses. A person convinced that he possessed a spiritual truth was required to conceal it from his own children. In the 20s, the religious education of children was classified as a political crime under Article 5810 of the Code. In other words, counter-revolutionary propaganda. Yes, that's how they're going to term it. That's how they termed it in the Soviet Union at the time. Let's see, Article 58 of the Code and Christianity. The religious cold USSR's religious Cold War. Huh. Oh, interesting. Okay. It says here the satanic roots of communism. Um, let's see, and here's Article 58. In the 20s, the religious education of children was classified as a political crime under Article 5810 of the Code. True, one was still permitted to renounce one's religion at one's trial. It didn't often happen. This is from the Gulag Archipelago. But it did nonetheless happen that the father would renounce his religion and remain at home to raise the children while the mother went to the Solovetsky Islands, which I think there was cannibalism that actually occurred there. Throughout all these years, women manifested great firmness in their faith. All persons convicted of religious activity received what are called tenors in the Gulag Archipelago, which means 10 years. The longest term then given of 10 years. That was like a pretty much a standard sentence. You were given a tenor, so you just told people, you said, I'm in for a tenor. Um, and let's see, Cleon Skousen goes into this more, and he does an excellent job of this. Just outlining a very simple, he reduces all this stuff to, he did this in 1958 long before anybody out here in America or the West really knew about the gulags very much. And not the Gulag Archipelago was not published until 1972 in French. So Cleon Skousen already knew. Now he added 45 communist goals that were designed to destroy America. He was a professor, a scholar, a Mormon, and an FBI agent. These goals included the following. I'll get into that maybe later. And I'm going to hold on to that. So all prisoners convicted of religious activity received tenors, the longest term then given. Okay, so this is a difference, though. They really remember the state is the god in these societies. So if there is anybody else that worships what they consider another god than the state, that is an absolute direct threat. They perceive that as a direct, scary, what's that? Clear and present danger. That's what to their ideology. So in those years, particularly in 1927, in purging the big cities for the pure society that was coming into being, they sent prostitutes to the Solovetsky Islands along with the nuns. Those lovers of a sinful earthly life were given 3-year sentences under a more lenient article of the Code. The conditions in prisoner transports, in transit prisons, and on the Solovetsky Islands were not of a sort to hinder them from plying their merry trade among the administrators and the convoy guards, and 3 years later they would return with laden suitcases to the places they had come from. Religious prisoners, however, were prohibited from ever returning to their children and their home areas. The Soviet Union was destroyed from within by their own people, by their own bureaucracy. It's pretty awful. Let's see. A student? Okay. So, and remember, the intelligentsia, who a lot of these ideas had come from, remember, the October Revolution in 1917, the Red October, this was academia who had come up with these ideas for this new world, this new Bolshevism, and that they had come up with these ideas. And remember, though, they always turn on their own. And eventually, when they get what they want, when the state gets to a powerful enough place, they will kill off even those people who supported them, those people who even came up with the idea of establishing a communist state, they end up destroying them as well. So these intelligentsia had never been overlooked in previous wave. It was not neglected in this one. And it was 1930. Okay, I think 37 to 38. I think so. Anyway, a student's denunciation that a certain lecturer in a higher educational institution kept citing Lenin and Marx frequently, but Stalin not at all, was all that was needed for the lecturer not to show up for lectures anymore. Oh, yes. Remember, the left eats its own. Left ideologies, a leftist view, which these people were. The Soviet Union was. This is leftism. This is the end result. You want to wokeism is just a modern day term for Bolshevism, and you hear this now in colleges too. Even the professors are actually afraid. There's professors there who are very adamant disciples of a one world order. But then there are professors too who are very scared. Even if they're on the left, they're liberal thinking, all this stuff, they're not going to be far enough left. Because that's the thing is about one thing about evil. This is Marxism, communism. You see it everywhere where this is practiced. It's never enough. They always have to heighten it. They always have to heighten the intensity of the censorship, of the imprisonments, of the vindictiveness, and the punishment. There is no such thing as a redemption. There's no such thing as a redemption. That's the thing about this religion. With Christianity, there is this amazing concept called atonement and redemption. Forgiveness for your sins. And communism works as a counterfeit to that. There is this thing of you need to be taught this new gospel, but there's no God. The state is God. And the difference, though, with this is the one part that they left out is there is no redemption. They copied many precepts from Christianity, like the need for redemption, the need for this thing that there will be a utopia after this life, all these things, but they want to make it now. And so but the one thing they left out conveniently is that redemption. There is no such thing as redemption, forgiveness, or anything. And that's why it's not a religion, it's a cult. Because if you vary or deviate, even to the slightest, in a cult, you will be ousted, banished, imprisoned, or executed. That's usually how the patterns are always there. May not be describing them in the most academic terms, but in my understanding, I recognize patterns. And I've read enough about communism to see that when communism is put into practice, at least here in this life, it's horrendous. It's disastrous. Because it's not just taking, say, somebody's money away. It's not just all these things. It's taking their lives away. And we saw the first effects of totalitarianism in the 20th century, where the industrial revolution had gotten us to a point where we were able and capable to kill millions of people in one fell swoop so easily, and it was always by the people's own government. It was rarely by another invading force, like a force that was going to war with that nation. Yes, there were thousands killed, but so many more. Look at how many, when the Nazis invaded Russia, yes, so many people were murdered because of them. were killed. The war took so many lives. But it was actually Stalin himself, the leader of Russia, who took hundreds of times more lives than the Nazis ever took of the Russians. 30 to 60 million people. Yeah, he was able to do that much more. I mean, look at how much more devastating one's own government is than an invading force. Okay? So a student's denunciation, so this is what stuff that happened. A student's denunciation that a certain lecturer in a higher educational institution kept citing Lenin and Marx frequently, but Stalin not at all, was all that was needed for the lecturer not to show up for lectures anymore. And what if he cited no one? So this is all it takes. What I mean by this is if you, and I was getting to that point, but I get off, that the student, this is happening in our schools today. So somebody's teaching at college and they're doing their best. They're supporting the regime. They're saying everything, all the leftist talking points. They're talking about how abortion is just wonderful and so many people should practice it. Globalism is great. We should all be eating bugs. Climate change is right here at our doorstep and we're all going to die tomorrow if we don't start, if we don't stop driving our cars today and turn off all our electricity and our heat right now. So all the left, even that is not enough for an evil regime. And that's the thing, is people are always going to be looking for more. Okay, because they're rewarded for that. If you're a snitch, you're rewarded in this society. This is a strange, cyclical society, a doomsday cult. It's childish, but it's put in practice, it's super deadly. So that's all it takes. And you hear about stories like this too, where a certain lecturer could be as left could be, but if they forget to mention something, or if they mention something just slightly that seems slightly sympathetic towards even being reasonable, even going, yeah, but I don't hate, say somebody could say at a super liberal college, I don't hate people who are conservatives, you know. That's a very dangerous phrase to say in college now. If you're a lecturer and you say, listen, I'm totally on the left, but I have a relative who's conservative, so of course, you know, I don't hate conservatives. My brother's conservative, and I love the guy, but I just disagree with him. That is enough. We're getting to the point where that could be enough to get you fired. So I just see echoes of this going on right now all over the place. The red flags are everywhere. Anyway, so mull over that as you please, and that's just something to think about. Okay, so it says here, Article 58 was just anything that was counter-revolutionary, anything that went against the narrative of the state. Okay? So, but for that matter, here's what he says, and this will help us get into the gist of the context. But for that matter, they soon took that kopeck, which a kopeck is just like cents of a dollar. So there's a ruble, but if you break up a ruble, if you spend it and they give you change, you'll get little kopecks back. That's how I understand their currency in Russia. They soon took that kopeck back during those same years and via those same sections of the boundless Article 58. Well, who in 1940 noticed the wave of wives arrested for failure to renounce their husbands? And who in Tambov remembers that during that year of peace, they arrested an entire jazz orchestra playing at the modern cinema, quote unquote, modern cinema theater, because they all turned out to be enemies of the people? And who noticed the 30,000 Czechs who in 1939 fled from occupied Czechoslovakia to their Slavic kinfolk in the USSR? It was impossible to guarantee that a single one of them was not a spy. They sent all of them off to northern camps. And it was not indeed in 1939 that we reached out our helping hands to the West Ukrainians and the West Belarusians, and in 1940 to the Baltic states and the Moldavians. It turned out that our brothers badly needed to be purged, right? And he's saying with a very sarcastic sense, a very heavy, dark humor here, but he's being serious. But it's also said with cynicism. It turned out that our brothers badly needed to be purged, and from them too flowed waves of social prophylactics. I had to look that up. What is prophylactics? It's medicine or something. It doesn't really do anything. Oh, come on. It's a protective or preventive treatment that aims to preserve the health and prevent spread of disease. Yes. Okay. Let's move on. The Germans went round in 1941. The Germans went round Taganrog, and this tells you how much the totalitarian Russian Bolshevik government just loved their citizens. Boy, they thought they were getting something better than the Tsar with this, and it was, I believe, worse than anything that even the Tsar could have possibly imagined. Even with the history of the Tsars and their murders and their purges, nope, the Bolsheviks couldn't be outdone. So they destroyed that record of how many people they could murder. In 1941, the Germans went around Taganrog, cutting it off so swiftly that prisoners were left in freight wagons, Russian prisoners, at the railway station where they had been brought to be evacuated. So the Russians were trying to evacuate Russian prisoners, okay? What should one do with them? Certainly not set them free, nor leave them to the Germans. Oil tank trucks were rushed to the station, and wagons were drenched with oil and set on fire. All of the prisoners were burned alive. Yeah. But see, if I was talking to a leftist right now, but they say, yeah, but I mean, they would start to go, well, there's got to be some nuances there. Well, maybe they weren't all burned alive, or maybe they didn't all die, or something like that. And I'm like, you're not getting it. You're not getting it. They just said you the prisoners were burned alive. I don't know if there's any more nuances you can take with that. How much more nuance do you need to get? But nuances are often used as a way to try to excuse actions or soften them. So the victory outside Moscow, let's see. The victory outside Moscow gave rise to a new wave. See, here's the thing. So the Nazis came to Moscow, but they ended up not conquering Moscow and not defeating Moscow because some of the bravest people, Russians, stayed behind in Moscow and fought. Okay, and you would think, gosh, the Russian state is going to give these guys medals for protecting the heart and the capital of the Soviet Union. That's not the case with leftism. The victory outside Moscow gave rise to a new wave, guilty Muscovites. Looking at things after the event, it turned out that those Muscovites who had not run away and who had not been evacuated but had fearlessly remained in a threatened capital which had been abandoned by the authorities were by that very token under suspicion either of subverting governmental authority or of staying on to await the Germans. And that's Article 5810 of the, counter-revolutionary stuff, which is, Article 58, let's just look up the gist of it, okay? 58, Soviet Union. It's a penal code. Article 58 was carte blanche. It was a penal code put in force in 1927 in Russia to prosecute those suspected of counter-revolutionary activities. Big, broad banner. But what does that mean? I don't know. How do I feel when I wake up that morning? Am I angry at Christians? Do I have it out for academics? Do I have it out for piano players? Do I have it out for people who wear their pajamas to Walmart? Do I have it out for people who drive big trucks? Do I have it out for people who drive electric cars? Do I have it out for people who don't put their Christmas trees away 2 days after Christmas? Do you see how ridiculous that is? But that's what they do. That's why censorship laws are very broad. They're never very specific because that leaves the door open to pick and choose how to punish people and who you want to punish that day. Okay? It leaves a lot of room under that umbrella. A carte blanche. I love that word for it, too. The penal code was to prosecute those suspected of counter-revolutionary activities. It was revised several times. In April, in particular, its Article 58-1 was updated by the listed subarticles and put in force on 8th June 1934. The article introduced the formal notion of the enemy of workers, those subject to Articles 58-2 to 58-13. 58-1 were considered traitors, 58-14 were considered saboteurs, and 58-2 through 13 were considered enemy of the workers. So they had this type of language and vocabulary they were using to tag people, very convenient labels. The article covered the following offenses. Look how broad this is. This is very broad. Definition of counter-revolutionary activity. A counter-revolutionary action is any action aimed at overthrowing or undermining or weakening of the power of the workers or peasants, Soviets, and governments of the USSR and Soviet and autonomous republics, or at the undermining or weakening of the external security of the USSR and main economical, action aimed at overthrowing, undermining, or weakening of the power of workers and peasants, Soviets, and governments of the Soviet. And the Soviet a Soviet was a workers' council, which gave the same name to the latter state of the Soviet. Soviets were the main form of government in the Russian and have to. Soviet is derived from the Russian word meaning council. Okay, so the bureaucracy, worker councils. A counter-revolutionary, the weakening of the power of the workers and peasant Soviets, worker councils, and governments of the USSR and Soviet and autonomous republics. Jeez, come on. Or at the undermining of weakening of the external security of the USSR and main economical, political, and national achievements of the proletarian revolution. It was not limited to anti-Soviet acts by international solidarity of workers. And 5810, 5810 is the real kicker. Anti-Soviet counter-revolutionary propaganda and agitation. At least 6 months of imprisonment. Most people got 10. In the conditions of unrest or war, same as 58-2. Let's see. This is what is this considered? Propaganda and agitation that called to overturn or undermine was punishment. Okay, this is another hole we don't want to get into. But anyway, you get the point. Okay, the victory. So do you see the heroes of Moscow who stayed behind and defended Moscow from the Nazis, from the Germans, from the Wehrmacht, which is the regular German army. Okay, so tons of people. They came over and they almost defeated Moscow, but they defended it. And they were like, yay. And the Soviets came in and immediately put, we're gonna arrest all of you under the Article 5810 of the Penal Code, which says anything that is perceived to be, that's the key word, perceived to be counter-revolutionary activities or some sort of propaganda or suspicion. Remember, suspicion drove this product. Suspicion drove the product of imprisonment. It drove this product. It drove, the final deliverable was people being sent to prisons. You had to feed the Gulag system. So here's another example too of some prisoners in Sweden, or some Russians who, during World War II, there was a Russian destroyer that went aground in the Swedish territory. and Sweden was neutral. So the crew proceeded to live freely in Sweden during all the rest of the war. And after the war, Sweden returned them to the Russians, to the Soviets, along with the destroyer. But their treason to the motherland was indubitable. But somehow the case didn't get off the ground. So the treason was that they had seen the West. They had experienced the fruits of capitalism, the fruits of the West, the fruits of a charitable society, the fruits of what the West had to offer, which was freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And this, there was no going back. You have betrayed them. Simply the fact that your destroyer went aground in Sweden and you ended up having to stay in Sweden for the rest of the war, you're guilty. Guilty by association already. You had already seen too much. So, let's see. Its crew proceeded to live freely in Sweden during all the rest of the war. After the war, Sweden returned to them the treason, but somehow the case didn't get off the ground. Okay, so they came back and they were like, okay, you're all going to go to prison. But it didn't quite get off the ground. They let them go their different ways and then pasted them with anti-Soviet agitation for their lovely stories in praise of freedom and good eating in capitalist Sweden. This was called the Kadenko group. What happened to this group later makes an anecdote. In camp, they kept their mouths shut about Sweden, fearing they'd get a second term. So they were put in jail, okay, because they had been in Sweden. And then they learned, just shut your mouth. Don't talk about Sweden. Don't talk about how it was great. Don't praise freedom. Don't praise how that you ate well. Nothing like that. Don't say anything. In camp, they kept their mouths shut about Sweden, fearing they'd get a second term. But people in Sweden somehow found out about their fate and published slanderous reports in the press. By that time, the boys were scattered far and near among various camps. Suddenly, on the strength of special orders, they were all yanked out and taken to the crusty prison in Leningrad. There they were fed for 2 months, so they were scrawny and starving. So they kept for 2 months, they fed them, fatten them up, make them look good, make them look like they're doing okay and they're healthy, as though for slaughter, and allowed them to let their hair grow out, so they didn't look like prisoners. They looked like normal people who didn't have a haircut, didn't have a buzz cut. Then they were dressed with modest elegance, rehearsed on what to say and to whom, and warned that any bastard who dared to speak out of turn would get a bullet in his skull. And they were led off to a press conference for selected foreign journalists and some others who had known the entire crew in Sweden. So this was to offset the propaganda, the news reports in the West, where people are like, hey, you threw those guys in prison. I can't believe that. Their prisons are terrible, yada, yada. So they come out, fed them, clothed them, made them look all nice and normal, and then said, okay, I'm going to put a bullet to your head if you don't tell us how wonderful the Soviet Union is, if you don't tell the media. And the former internees bore themselves cheerfully in front of the cameras, okay? Or I'm sorry, on the radio, for the newspapers, sorry. Described where they were living, studying, and working, and expressed their indignation at the bourgeois slander they had read about not long before in the Western press. After all, Western papers are sold in the Soviet Union at every corner newsstand. And so they had written to one another and decided to gather in Leningrad. Their travel expenses didn't bother them in the least. Their fresh, shiny appearance completely gave the lie to the newspaper Kanar. The discredited journalists went off to write their apologies. It was wholly inconceivable to the Western imagination that there could be any other explanation, and the men who had been the subjects of the interview were taken off to a bath, had their hair cut off again, were dressed in their former nasty rags, and sent back to the same Gulag camps. But because they had conducted themselves properly, none of them was given a second term. Okay. Let's see. Okay, here's another one. Some of them had acted out of conviction. Others had been let's see. Along with them were seized not less than 1 million fugitives from the Soviet government. Civilians of all ages and both sexes who had been fortunate. Okay, so this is the context. Here it is. All along during 1945 and 1946, a big wave of genuine, at long last, Enemies of the Soviet government flowed into the archipelago. These were the Vlasov men, the Krasnov Cossacks, and Muslims from the national units created under Hitler. Okay, these were people who had fled the Soviet government. Okay, some of them had acted out of conviction, others had been merely involuntary participants. So now they've all been given back to the Soviet Union. Okay, the Allies gave them back. This is pretty damning. Along with them were seized not less than 1 million fugitives from the Soviet government, civilians of all ages and both sexes who had been fortunate enough to find shelter on Allied territory, but who in 1946 and 47 were perfidiously returned by Allied authorities into Soviet hands. It is surprising that in the West, where political secrets cannot be kept long, since they inevitably come out in print or disclosed, the secret of this particular act of betrayal has been very well and carefully kept by the British and American governments. This is truly the last secret, or one of the last of the Second World War. Having often encountered these people in camps, I was unable to believe for a whole quarter century that the public in the West knew nothing of this action of the Western governments, this massive handing over of ordinary Russian people to the retribution and death. Remember, these people, a lot of them had got escaped from the Soviets, okay, back in the era from, I suspect, the 20s all the way to the 40s, that were finally like, we got away from the Soviet Union. Oh, no. The British and Americans, these over 1 million people, over 1 million of them were handed back to the Russians. And most likely, most of them were probably executed, especially these people. Not just jailed, but executed, because the Soviets had it out for them. Having often encountered these people in the camps, I was unable to believe for a whole quarter century. Yes, you encountered these people. The West knew nothing of this massive handing over of ordinary Russian people to retribution and death, not until 1973. In the Sunday Oklahoman of January 21st was an article by Julius Epstein published. And I am here going to be so bold as to express gratitude on behalf of the mass of those who perished and those few left alive. One random little document was published from the many volumes of the hitherto concealed case history of forced repatriation to the Soviet Union. After having remained unmolested in British hands for 2 years, they had allowed themselves to be lulled into a false sense of security, and they were therefore taken completely by surprise. They did not realize they were being repatriated. That's actually repatriated. They did not realize they were being repatriated. They were mainly simple peasants with bitter personal grievances against the Bolsheviks. So these were people who were against the Bolshevik Revolution, who were against the Bolsheviks. The English authorities gave them the treatment reserved in the case of every other nation for war criminals alone, that of being handed over, against their will, to captors who incidentally were not expected to give them a fair trial. They were all sent to destruction on the archipelago. The American authorities did the same. In Bavaria as well as on the U.S. territory, they delivered tens of thousands of Soviet citizens to a cruel fate, turning them over to the Soviets against their will. So that did happen. Yep. Okay. So let's look at this, the interrogation techniques. And this is the thing, of course, if you talk to a leftist or somebody, they will say, oh, well, maybe it wasn't that bad or it wasn't that many people. Yet here we are. Okay, the prisoners, if the intellectuals in the plays of Chekhov, who spent all their time guessing what would happen in 20, 30, or 40 years, had been told that in 40 years interrogation by torture would be practiced carte blanche in Russia, that prisoners would have had their skulls squeezed with iron rings, that a human being would be lowered into an acid bath, that they would be trussed up naked to be bitten by ants and bedbugs, that a ramrod heated over a Primus stove would be thrust up their anal canal, the secret brand, that a man's genitals would be slowly crushed beneath the toe of a jackboot, and that in the luckiest possible circumstances, prisoners would be tortured by being kept from sleeping for a week, by thirst, and by being beaten to a bloody pulp. Not one of Chekhov's plays would have gotten to its end, because all of the heroes would have gone off to insane asylums. Yet, not only Chekhov's heroes, but what normal Russian at the beginning of the century, including any member of the Russian Socialist Democratic Workers' Party, even the people who were massively in support of Bolshevism, in support of Lenin, in support of the Red Revolution, none of you, I have a suspicion that many of those supporters didn't even have the slightest inkling that this would be a defining hallmark of their party, of their revolution. This is what people would remember. Okay? Not workers' rights, not labor rights, not equality, not equity. What they would remember is that prisoners would have their skulls squeezed with iron rings, that human beings would be lowered into acid baths, that they would be trussed up naked to be bitten by ants and bedbugs, that a ramrod heated over a primus stove would be thrust up their anal canal, that a man's genitals would be slowly crushed beneath the toe of a jackboot. No, you didn't imagine that, did you, leftists? Did you? The woke don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. That's why they always go for the super young. Because they're young, they're naive, they're stupid. They haven't had any life experience. So to them, it's more viewed through the lens of a bit of a game, you know? And then as they get older, they realize the barbarism, that it's all laced with massive barbarism. Okay? Even Peter the Great, even Byron, even Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich in the 17th century, these people, all these sins that they, all these murders, these things that these people committed, even Catherine the Great, they couldn't have imagined how the Bolsheviks freed them of being blamed for some of the worst atrocities in history. And now we have the Soviet Union as the standard, the lowest standard of atrocity in the world, probably next to the Nazis. These two. Let's see. The time allotted for investigation was not used to unravel the crime, but in 95 cases out of 100 to exhaust, wear down, weaken, and render helpless the defendant so that he would want it to end at any cost. Okay, now, this is interesting. It talks about investigation and inquiry. What does this mean? An inquiry, in the Dictionary of Definitions, it says, an inquiry is distinguished from an investigation by the fact that it is carried out to determine whether there is a basis for proceeding to an investigation. Oh, the sacred simplicity. He's being sarcastic. The organs, the Soviet state, have never heard of such a thing as inquiry. Lists of names prepared up above, or an initial suspicion or denunciation by an informer, or any anonymous denunciation, were all that was needed to bring about the arrest of the suspect, followed by the inevitable formal charge. The time allotted for investigation was not used to unravel the crime, but in 95 cases out of 100 to exhaust, wear down, weaken, and render helpless the defendant so that he would want it to end at any cost. This is how they got confessions. Okay, was you simply accused the person the entire time, you tortured them, you wore them down, you made them sleepless, you made them helpless, so that in the end they would just confess. And most of the times people didn't do anything. Most people weren't guilty of anything. And they just simply tortured them enough to where they would finally just sign a confession. Whatever you want, I'll sign it. You've crushed my genitals, I'm probably gonna die. So I'll sign whatever. I'm in so much pain. Okay, so here's some of the interrogation techniques. As early as 1921, interrogations usually took place at night. At that time, too, they shone automobile lights in the prisoner's face. And at the Lubyanka in 1926, they made use of the hot air heating system to fill the cell first with icy cold, and then with stinking hot air, And there was an airtight cork-lined cell in which there was no ventilation, and they cooked the prisoners. A participant in the Yaroslav uprising of 1918, Vasily Alexandrovich Kasyanov, described how the heat in such a cell was turned up until your blood began to ooze through your pores. When they saw this happening to the people, they would put the prisoner on a stretcher and take him off to sign his confession. The hot and salty methods of the gold period were well known. And in Georgia, in 1926, they used lighted cigarettes to burn the hands of prisoners under interrogation. In Metekhi prison, they pushed prisoners into a cesspool in the dark. In only one respect did Wyszynski failed to be consistent and retreat from dialectical logic. For some reason, the executioner's bullet which he allowed was not relative but absolute. Okay, that has to do with the dialect. I'm not going to get into that right now. But anyway, thanks for watching. I should have showed more of that. Anyway, I just thought that was so... It's eye-opening, and no wonder, Marxists and communists in America who have been embedded in the education system since Mark Hughes came over from the Frankfurt School. So that's since the late 40s, I think, embedded in the academic system. So when, oh my gosh, what's his face? Who's the guy who wrote it? I can't believe I'm losing it here. Let's see. Okay, Solzhenitsyn. That's how to say it. So he came over and then he started giving lectures because, they were like, oh, please come speak at our college and all this. But he condemned like materialism. He condemned celebrity worship in the U.S. He condemned things like this because he was basically saying these are the things that led to what happened in the Soviet Union, these types of things. These are some of the things. And there were elements, I believe, elements of communists who hated Solzhenitsyn because they're like, damn it, we are the Soviet state and we have infiltrated the academic system. KGB did a really good job infiltrating the academic system and in America, yes, America, and infiltrating churches like black churches especially. And if you want to see the reference for that, please look up Manning Johnson, The Color of Communism. He wrote that, black academic who wrote that. Who was actually a communist himself. Or look up the writings of Thomas Sowell, who said that he was a Marxist when he was younger. Now he's a total capitalist. He is an amazing philosopher and amazing author. Highly recommend it. Black philosopher. Yep, he's a black guy too. And they just talk about how communists infiltrated those areas first. The areas of psychology, academia, and black churches were the first things that they really tried to infiltrate because they realized class warfare didn't work so well here. The classical communism, Soviet-style communism of the worker versus the employer, the peasant versus the landlord, that didn't work very well in America, but they tapped into racism, and they used that in the same way. It's the same template. They just say, the oppressor versus the oppressed. It's not the worker versus the employer. It's the black person versus the white person. Anything to divide. That's what Marxism is based on. The end result is what's the end? What's the desire in the end? The desire in the end is total control. So Solzhenitsyn, of course, came over and he got a Nobel Prize, all this stuff, but I feel like there were many who are like, oh, crap. I've been hired. I know who I work for. I work for the Soviet Union. I work for the communists, and we can't have this. So that's the academic system is plenty full of those people who are actual actors, bad faith actors who are here to disrupt. That's their job. They've been hired. They're being paid. They're getting remuneration for dividing Americans, for destroying the academic system, because many of these horrible ideas that we see in policy come from academia. And that's why you see trusted things that were should have been trusted, but are not. Deep state entities like the FBI, the intelligence agencies, they're invaded by these leftist ideas. And they always have been proponents of these leftist ideas. Crazy ass ideas. Total control. And so I'll fight that till my dying day, I'll tell you that much. I'm serious. So anyway, I love it. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Thanks. Bye.